Well, hello everyone and welcome to VLGA Connect. It's time for the weekly governance update. It's the 11th of February 2022, would you believe? And with thanks to Hunt and Hunt Lawyers, it's my pleasure as always to say hello to Stephen Cooper.
Hello, Chris Eddy.
How are you?
I'm well. Another busy week.
It's been a big week, lots of news, and I know you've got something you want to get off your chest with our primary law enforcement agency.
Do I? A big rebuke to Victoria Police, Chris. How dare they announce the laying of charges against a now former Moreland councillor after we finished recording the governance update last Friday? I'd really like them to get their timing a bit better.
Like literally within minutes, and we don't have the budget to go back and do lots of re-records, unfortunately, folks, so we just said this will just have to wait. And actually it's worked out all right because there's been quite a bit that's developed since that time, not the least of which being that particular councillor has resigned, and we found that out through a VCAT hearing that was underway this week.
Exactly, and it has been reported as recently as in the Age today, Chris, that there is still obviously a process to be gone through to fill that vacancy, but also we're waiting on VCAT to make a determination regarding the validity, if you like, of the original election, where there are something like 80 votes in question.
So can we just drill down on that a little bit? So the question about the validity of the election has been around for quite some time. It's been in front of VCAT for months, really. What happens in terms of a countback to fill that councillor vacancy if VCAT hasn't yet made a determination? Or is it an option to wait for a VCAT decision before the position is filled?
I don't know. I'm not 100% sure, Chris, but I can't imagine the Electoral Commission proceeding with a recount without some certainty that they're on solid footing regarding the validity of the election in the first place. And remembering that VCAT is a party, the Electoral Commission is a party to the VCAT matter regarding the validity of the election. So I'd imagine there's lawyers having a bit of a conversation around what the likely status and timing of that matter is. Can I take that back a step?
Sure.
So we're talking about, I think, in terms of the scuttlebutt, about 80 votes. And the scuttlebutt is that these are votes predominantly that might have been not secure in letterboxes at high-density units, for example. And the allegation that's been made is that they were removed and completed by someone. And then obviously it was found when people, good on them and bless them, who wanted to undertake their civic duty by voting, thought that they hadn't received a vote. And that was what alerted DEC.
If they weren't feeling like they needed to perform their civic duty, it may never have become known.
Exactly. So isn't it a good thing that people are civic-minded? That's one of the protections that we've got for our electoral system.
So for those who aren't across this, there's quite a bit of reporting, as Steve said, on the Age. We're talking about the Northwest Ward of Moreland Council. The councillor who was declared elected was Malad El Halabi, a member of the Labor Party, but member of the Labor Party, councillor. Neither of those things apply any longer, as I understand it.
That's it. And these are matters that obviously need to go through VCAT. You would imagine will proceed through the court process. So we're a long way to go yet, Chris.
All right. We'll keep people posted on that, but I'm sure those who are really interested will be following it as closely as we have. We've had another councillor resignation this week, Steve, out at Mitchell Shire Council, where Councillor Christine Banks has resigned due to personal and health reasons. This will trigger a countback next month.
Now, Chris, you've been across this because it's not only in Mitchell, but there are a number of councillor resignations across the state that have occurred recently where positions have either recently been filled or we're in the process at the moment.
There have been, and I'm not sure whether we're on a track for more departures than the normal cycle. I know we always have a few. And of course, what keeps this a little bit confusing and interesting is in some cases it triggers countbacks, in others it triggers by-elections, because that depends on the electoral structure that's in place at that particular council. And I just did a little bit of recent research because I wanted to put this gender parity lens across it. mainly because the Yarra Ranges by-election, which is coming up, is to fill a vacancy vacated by a female councillor.
Yes.
There are 6 male candidates standing for that election and no females, which is a concern in and of itself, and puts at risk, if it becomes a trend, obviously, that excellent record that is built up in Victoria in terms of male-female gender distribution.
And that's obviously an ongoing piece of work, but yes, it does.
So, as I say, I had a look. Maroonda's by-election is coming up. It's 50-50 there. There are 5 female and 5 male candidates, so that's a good sign. Both of those elections, though, Maroonda and Yarra Ranges, are to replace women councillors, so we know at least one of those is going to be a male councillor. At Moira, we've had 2 councillors replaced recently, a male and a female, replaced with a female and male, so that preserves the parity there, or the ratio, I should say. And at Alpine Shire, we had a female councillor step down, replaced by a male councillor. So puts that number at risk if this was to be replicated. And you've got to ask the question, why, particularly in Yarra Ranges, have no female candidates put their hand up for that by-election?
And we'll ask, but we won't know the answer. As close as we'll know to the answer, Chris, is that, as listeners will be aware, the VLGA has been in partnership with the universities of La Trobe and Melbourne in relation to some research being undertaken by Professors Andrea Carson and Leah Ruppiner regarding the barriers, if you like, to women standing for local government. And I was advised by Professor Carson during the week that the latest round of survey research is just closing out now. So, and there's at least 160 responses to that. So we're hoping to get another round of data that might shed a little light, but it is a very complex picture.
And then, of course, in the background, or perhaps not so much in the background, you've got the lead up to a federal election and quite a strong campaign going on to encourage more women to stand. Big independent movement, a lot to play out there, and we'll be watching that with great interest as well.
And maybe we'll just close that part of the conversation off, Chris, with if we're talking about culture, with the words of the Australian of the Year at the Press Club this week: when we act with integrity, the tide rises with us. So I guess a reminder that being the best place we can be has a lot of community benefits. That's
a nice quote, a nice adaptation of the "a rising tide lifts all boats." I think I didn't see that. I've certainly that Press Club thing, unfortunately, but I've seen a lot of commentary about it. It seems like it was a very powerful and notable event.
Couldn't put it better, Chris. Absolutely worth watching.
Steve, now one of our regular listeners has got in touch with you and suggested an expectation we'd be talking about cricket this week. And when you told me that, I was scratching my head thinking, but then I realised I had heard, I think, just a little bit of news, just a tiny little item somewhere, that the Australian cricket coach had stepped down. Now, have I got that right? It was the coach that stepped down?
The coach stepped down. I think it was resigned to avoid a more fractious parting of the ways, Chris. And I should say that our correspondent is probably off the chart in terms of their interest in cricket compared with the general populace. Right. So any excuse. But there was a nice message in that. Look, I'll do this really quickly, Chris, because people won't want to get stuck on it. So the Australian Cricket Board parted ways with Justin Langer, who's been the coach for 4 years. And Justin Langer was appointed to get the team out of a particular cultural issue post the Sandpaper Gate affair in South Africa. On the sandpaper theme, it's fair to say that the reputation of the coach was that he had an abrasive style. Did you see what I did then?
Yes, I did.
And while there's been speculation of his future, there have been a number of former players who have come out very strongly in defence of Justin Langer and, called for the captain of the team to make comments and so on. And my only comment would be that, well, they would come out in defence of their mate, wouldn't they? And I'm not sure when a South African, Mickey Arthur, was dismissed from the same position that they were so supportive of him.
Right.
And it really begs an obvious question when people are commenting on things like that. Well, where are they coming from? Pat Cummins, the captain, made an interesting and I think a terrific statement eventually and shouldn't have had to. basically made the comment that Justin brought a lot to the team, didn't need to apologise for his behaviour, although he had, but maybe we need a different style of leadership moving forward. And I thought the message for any council or actually any senior leadership is that transition has impacts beyond the immediate parties, and when those are undertaken, perhaps the wider view should be undertaken. And it's always good when those arrangements are done well.
Is this a case of we needed a wartime Prime Minister and now the war's over and we need a peacetime Prime Minister in place?
I think it's a really good way of putting it, Chris.
Right.
Yeah, a really good way of putting it. You know, desperate times call for desperate measures, and perhaps a punitive directive approach wasn't what was needed going forward.
Okay, so there's your dose of cricket for that person. Never fails to amaze me how we can weave cricket in. Did you want to weave in Winter Olympics or tennis? I'm always happy to try and weave tennis in.
Oh, I just thought it's been interesting, the machinations of the International Olympic Committee trying to inveigle itself into the Peng Shui issue when perhaps they're a little bit too close to the Chinese Communist Party to be providing a independent view. Right, seems you asked for my opinion, Chris.
Yeah, no, we'll leave that there. I don't want to get on the wrong side of international politics from our humble little place here at the governance update. But you did want to go back to a conversation we had last week around culture. We talked about what had occurred at the Shire of Ravensthorpe in Western Australia with that CEO there ultimately pleading guilty to those charges in court last week. What was it about that you've been reflecting on, Steve?
Chris, I was thinking after we spoke, and you'll recall we said that, and I think genuinely hold the view, it is very difficult for a councillor to know exactly what's going on. Like, how could the council know that the CEO was spending that money for that reason? But I also didn't want to sort of downplay the fact that this all goes to culture, and was reminded for a whole lot of reasons during the week that, leadership sets the culture in an organisation, and one of the absolute critical elements is the capacity of people to speak up safely and to feel psychologically safe when speaking up. Mm. And so in a sense, without talking about Ravensthorpe in particular, having an eye to whether it's in regard to fraud, to work health and safety, or just performing work generally, what we do to create that speak-up environment is absolutely critical.
And would you expect to see people talking about that particular issue in their responses to the culture review discussion paper? Do you think? Will it tease that sort of thing out?
I'd be disappointed if the culture review doesn't address psychological safety, because ultimately that's at the core of pretty much every other piece of cultural work that we do. When we're talking about culture, it's around what are the day-to-day behaviours that are exhibited. And if the day-to-day behaviour is a message of, don't raise that because they don't want to hear that, don't raise that, it's a career-limiting move, then you've stifled, good communication in your organisation. So I would hope that psychological safety to speak up should be front and centre, Chris.
We talked last week about whether councils would be putting their own submissions into that paper, or whether it would be more likely we'll see a lot of personal submissions. I've had a couple of people reach out since that episode, Steve. In fact, last week's episode seems to have struck a chord, certainly in terms of viewer numbers and podcast downloads, which is nice to see. Or maybe it's just people are back.
Yeah, it might be that.
For 2022. But we touched on whether councils would put a submission to it through a formal chamber process. And I'd be really interested to hear from more councillors out there, or CEOs for that matter, on whether they're going to do that or not. So one example I'm aware of, which is I think a terrific example, is that pretty much all of the councillors have gotten together and talked through the discussion paper and made notes on what they'd like to say, and that's being put together into a submission. And the question was, should that be a formal submission put through the chamber? My view is, yeah, it probably should. If that's representing all of the views of all of the councillors, why not make that a formal position of the council? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I agree. And I'm extraordinarily agnostic on that topic in a case like this, Chris. I kind of think whatever needs to happen for the councillor view to get to the review, do it. And I've heard of some councils going through that process and basically designing their own submission, putting it through the chamber. Some where the councillors have workshopped and either written their own or asked the governance team to finish it, polish it off, having the mayor send that through. Somewhere the governance team have talked to the councillors and are putting a formal process, individual councillors, individual CEOs. So there's a myriad of responses. I just think the more the better. And anyone in any of those categories I've mentioned that's done a response, if you'd like to flick it through to us at the VLGA, I'd be very keen for a read as well, because we'll be using any information that we get to inform ours.
And so what you're really saying is there's no right way or wrong way to do this, but the right thing is to participate in the process.
I think so, but also to have clarity around how it's being written and to make sure that the author is clear who they're writing for.
Yeah.
So that, if you've got your governance team writing it for you, have a really clear process so that whoever the author is has an agency to get whatever information is required. Are they allowed to express minority views? Is it majority only? Whatever the ground rules are need to be cleared up early.
Good thought, Steve. As always, you go a little bit deeper on those things, which is appreciated. Now, ethics. You've been doing a bit of reading, and I know a good associate of yours has published some excellent information about how ethics should be guiding your way. This is in a financial sense, I think, isn't it?
It was written in regard to financials, but yeah, so if I go back a step, Chris, my friend and occasional business collaborator, Dr. Attractor Lagan, posted a piece on LinkedIn, and I think we can put the Forbes article on the show notes around an ethical GPS guiding your way. And it was a nice reminder to me that in terms of this culture topic, there is a difference between ethics and integrity or morality. So integrity and morality are right and wrong, don't steal money. That's an integrity question. Ethics is, what's the right thing to do? And a lovely little 9-step plan in this article around actually deciding whether you've got an ethical dilemma, like trusting your gut, determining the stakeholders. What would your various stakeholders think of the issue? Because often we have an ethical issue when we don't consider our stakeholders fully. We maybe only consider one. Your professional obligations, Chris, you would have found a spot where sometimes it's difficult to, and you need to dig deep, I suppose, to work out what your obligation is at a particular time.
Okay, we'll absolutely put that link in the show notes for people to dig a little bit deeper on that. We're sort of going to go down this risk OHS sort of path now, Steve. A couple of news items that I know this one caught your eye. A Victorian mechanical firm has been convicted and fined over a crash that killed 3 people in the state's northeast almost 8 years ago. This happened in Wodonga, and you think there's some lessons for us all in this?
Oh, look at an awfully tragic circumstance, Chris, where a petrol tanker, basically the tanker decoupled from the prime mover, and 3 people were killed. And it just reminded me that as councils, we are big operators of plant, and there's a huge health and safety risk. The thing that was really interesting for me in that article, well, there's a whole lot that's interesting, not the least a tragedy, was that the company was undone because they had done I think they called it a tug test, where basically every so often they just, tug the prime mover to make sure that the linkage still works.
Right.
And it's one of those pieces of equipment that will work very well until it fails. And then when it fails catastrophically. The company was a bit unlucky because that kind of test was commonplace amongst similar operators. But, when you get to the magistrates court, it was found that there was, in fact, a preferred way of doing that test. And again, because the consequences are so tragic, that's been one of the issues for the company in being fined almost $300,000, not to mention the other, issues of having to deal with that sort of tragedy.
Steve, I'm reminded of a story, and I didn't put this in the list, that's also come out in the last week out of New South Wales, where a council, in this case Camden Council, has been fined $750,000 after a member of a local men's shed was killed installing irrigation pipe at an equestrian park. And there was some findings in this that I think council should take note of around volunteers and supervising of work and having the necessary qualifications to do certain sorts of projects. Just a terrible, terrible story. Men's shed, male volunteer, trying to do the right thing in the community, and it leads to this tragic outcome.
Yeah, laying drainage pipes at an equestrian park, I believe, Chris. Yes. And the person was struck by one of the pipes. The person operating the plant wasn't qualified. There hadn't been an appropriate job safety analysis done. And it would be very easy, and we don't know the circumstance, but you could say it would be very easy with people willingly wanting to jump in and just get the job done to not be hung up with the sort of health and safety bureaucracy. And this is the consequence when it doesn't happen. So just tragic.
We'll put the link to that one in the show notes too, if people would like to do some research on that. And in terms of looking forward from an OHS point of view, you've come across some advice for the public sector more broadly on things to be looking out for this year.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Our friend Sarah Rye posted on LinkedIn a piece that I saw from the Victorian Government Solicitor's Office called OHS in 2022, What Should Be on Your Radar? And there were three things mentioned in that Victorian Government Solicitor's piece that were really important. And one is that the reporting obligations under the Act have been increased. So near misses that maybe didn't need to be reported previously may well need to be reported. And that's a really important element. We should be looking at the things that nearly went wrong because eventually they might. There have been an extension of psychosocial risks to be controlled in the workplace. So greater identification of those, emotional and mental health issues, I suppose, that might affect people at work. And a flag, I suppose, that government generally is going to be subject to greater levels of enforcement. So worth thinking about. And again, Chris, it probably takes us back to the culture question around what is our safety culture, whether we are generally engaged in it or are we somewhere around turning a blind eye because we don't think things are material. And all of these things, I think, send a sign that, a culture of safety is just critical.
A real theme creeping into our conversation this week, because another one that caught our eye was an article looking at indemnity provisions that are being talked about for the Chief Public Health Officer. Have I got that right? The Chief Health Officer. The
Chief Health Officer, in a piece in the Herald Sun, Chris, and some rather spectacular reporting, I think would be the best way we could describe it.
Spectacular or fantastic, in the sense that fantastic is unbelievable and out of this world?
Maybe fantastic is quite good. The article, to my memory, it was a bit of an outrage piece that this is, and we're going to diligently not talk about I Cook Foods, but quoting the operator, who in fairness was probably just asked a question, and opened with a quote from the operator of I Cook Foods saying that senior legal figures would be horrified that legislation is going to come through that will spare the Chief Health Officer from personal liability in regard to decisions made under the Act.
Really?
The piece then, of course, Chris managed to spectacularly avoid talking to any senior legal figure who might express such horror and outrage.
I was going to say, who are these senior legal people?
Well, I'd like to know, but it did remind me that there's a couple of issues. One is, well, should public servants and bureaucrats be subject to personal liability? Is that in the public interest? And what is the situation in local government? And, of course, Tony Rownick is probably having conniptions at the moment because we're about to drift into legal speak, which he'll be listening very carefully.
He can always come on next week and correct anything that we've done this week.
Absolutely. And I guess, Chris, I look at it first and foremost as a public interest question. Actually, just say you took your car to the mechanic, to the workshop, and the mechanic mucked up and didn't quite fix your car properly. Are you going to take action against the individual mechanic, or is your commercial recourse against the business? It's the business, isn't it?
Of course it is, yes.
And
sorry, I wasn't sure you were expecting me to answer. It's pretty obvious, I think.
Yeah, and the same thing applies. Do we really want bureaucrats adding potential personal liability to their decision-making processes when they're making difficult decisions about people's lives and businesses and so on. Like, I kind of think it's a good thing if they just stick to their knitting and consider the things that they should consider.
There's a parallel here with local government CEOs and members of council staff, is there not, in that there's an indemnity provision in place that if you act in good faith and make appropriate decisions, that you can't be held responsible under any action or claim that arises from that good faith decision.
Absolutely, Chris, and you've beautifully segued into Section 52 of the Local Government Act, which says precisely that. And it doesn't even mean that officers have to get the decision right, but their decision has to be well-founded and made for the right reason. So that's sort of good faith question, and they need to be acting in accordance with an act. Now, if a public official strays and misuses their position or profits inappropriately from the position, then you're sort of drifting into criminal liability. But realistically, the number of issues for which a council officer, for example, might be liable, you're really talking either that kind of corruption end or sort of a criminal misconduct kind of situation. And I guess the landmark one that I can think of is way back in 1988 when the Dandenong swimming pool wall collapsed, and the then chief engineer of the Dandenong Council, former Dandenong Council, was prosecuted for an health and safety breach because of a non-feasance kind of like a negligent oversight in the way that work was supervised, when it was said that he should have known that it needed to be supervised. But really, you're talking about a circumstance where if people are acting in good faith for the right reason as public servants, that they should be, there's no reason why they should be suffering, personal liability.
Steve, I've just tried to open that Herald Sun story. It's behind a paywall, unfortunately for me. So I'm going to ask this question in good faith. Is there not already a good faith provision in place for the public health officer?
I would presume there is, Chris, and I didn't dive into this, but I'm only presuming that because of the pandemic legislation, although this is Food Act, right, that it's some sort of tidying up of legislation to reflect what there is in any event. I can't imagine that anyone would reasonably suggest that a delegate making a decision regarding closure of a business might be subject of personal liability unless those sort of thresholds that we've just talked about have been passed, in which case the protection should be there anyway. And in any event, anyone aggrieved should still have a right of action against the agency that's made the decision.
All right, look, we're going to need to wrap it up. I've got 3 quick things I wanted to mention, and they're probably things, some of them at least, that we can come back to. The decriminalisation of sex work, the Act, I understand, has gone through the Parliament. We probably need to look at the impact, if any, on council powers. I know there's been some, how do I put this, misinformation perhaps propagated through the debate on that Act. I know you saw some of that, Steve. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that the level of uncertainty still is around what's the kind of a couple of uncertainties, but what's the as of right entitlement for sex work to be undertaken on a property under the Planning and Environment Act without a permit being required. Still a bit of uncertainty there, and we'll watch this space.
And it may be we reach out to our friends at Hunt & Hunt to see if we can do an explainer on that Act and its implications for local government.
That'd be a good thing to do.
Stuart James, the Mayor of Monash, has put out a thread on Twitter and I assume other social media, I'm not sure, that I think is really worth people having a look at if you want any sort of clarity on how councils function in terms of decision-making in Victoria. I know this has been prompted by a particular issue in Monash, but it was a really good explainer, I know you saw it too, Steve, on the role of the mayor, the role of the executive, the role of the council acting as a collective, making formal decisions, but it bears repeating.
I suspect Stuart was prompted by a bit of misinformation, and we know that bin collection will get people's attention and potentially get their gander up. So a bit of misinformation around who makes decisions and why those decisions were made, and I just think all credit to Councillor James for doing that explainer, which I thought was just terrific.
Look for that on Twitter under his Twitter account if you'd like to have a look. And I just wanted to make a brief note. I know a lot of councils interact with the Level Crossing Removals Project Authority, and they've just been recognised with an International IAP2 award. That's the International Association of Public Participation. I think I've got that right. And they've been awarded, if I can just change my screen here, with the IAP2 International Organisation of the Year. So congratulations to them.
Well done to them, Chris. Yes. I just wanted to say one thing, Chris. We've talked about Fast Track recently on the 18th of March. We nearly filled the venue. We're going to find room for another 10 more people than we thought we would. We can do that quite safely. We are quite committed to not making it a cast of thousands, though, as I said before. But even with those extra people, we are 2/3 subscribed already for that event. So anyone that's thinking, any councillor, mayor, deputy mayor thinking of going, please get your registration in as soon as possible.
I did predict that this would be a high demand event. The program looks sensational, folks, and if you don't get in and reserve your place, you'll be kicking yourself, I reckon. All right, that's all for this week then. Thank you, Steve. Have a great week, and we'll talk to you next week on the Governance Update.
Thanks, Chris. You too.
Steve Cooper, Chief of Staff of the VLGA, and all that's left for me to do is to thank you for viewing and watching in ever-increasing numbers, which is lovely, and to thank Hunt & Hunt Lawyers, our sponsor of the Governance Update from VLGA Connect. Bye for now.